patris humanatoro, dunguela salutatoro, salutata fecundatur virinecia.
Aristotle's On Interpretation, chapters 5 through 8, part 1, according to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. In the previous video on interpretation, we divided sound down to its species, enunciation. In the present video, we're going to subdivide enunciations. But first, let's quickly review the subdivision of sound. Sound is subdivided into non-vocal sound and vocal sound. Vocal sound is subdivided into insignificant vocal sound and significant vocal sound. Significant vocal sound is subdivided into naturally significant and conventionally significant. Conventionally significant is subdivided into word and speech. Word is subdivided into name, participle, and verb. Speech is subdivided into imperfect speech and perfect speech. Perfect speech is subdivided into ordering, which is subdivided into vocative, interrogative, imperative, and deprecative, and enunciation. Enunciation is speech in which there is truth or falsehood. This is the sort of speech we're going to be studying in this video. This video is going to begin to subdivide speech. The next video will complete the subdivision. There are 6 ways to divide enunciations. The first way is to divide them into one and many. This gives us categorical and composite enunciations. The second way is to divide them by their quality or species. This gives us affirmative and negative enunciations. The third way is to divide them by their quantity. This gives us universal, particular, indefinite, and singular enunciations. The fourth way is to divide them in comparison to things. This gives us true and false enunciations. The fifth way is to divide them by their time or tense. The sixth way is to divide enunciations by their matter. This gives us necessary matter, possible matter, and impossible matter. The present video will only look at the division of enunciations in the first 3 ways, and will leave the next 3 ways to future videos. When we subdivide enunciations into one and many, what we're talking about is whether there's only one enunciation, or multiple enunciations, or something in between. Now, when there's just one enunciation, or one enunciation simply speaking, we have a categorical enunciation. This is an enunciation that predicates simply one thing of one thing. It can also be called a simple enunciation. Here are some examples. Socrates is wise. All humans are animals. Every human is a rational animal. Let's look more closely at these examples. When we say Socrates is wise, we're predicating one quality of one substance. We're predicating wise, which is a quality, of Socrates, which is a substance. When we say all humans are animals, it might seem that this isn't one enunciation because animals and humans are both plural, but it's still one enunciation. The unity of an enunciation is not disturbed by the fact that the words are plural. We're still predicating one thing of one thing, one nature, namely animal nature, of another nature, namely human nature. Likewise, in this last example, we might be tripped up by the fact that the predicate has 2 words, rational, animal. But this is still one enunciation because rational animal is not 2 things, namely a rational thing and an animal thing, but just one thing, a rational animal. And so we're still just predicating one thing of one thing, even though there's 2 words in the predicate. Categorical enunciations are called categorical from the Greek word for predicate. The reason that they're called categorical enunciations, or predicate enunciations, is because they're enunciations where there's just one predicate, and the most notable part of these enunciations is the predicate. These enunciations are one simply speaking. So if we just say that there's one enunciation and don't add further qualification, what we're talking about is a categorical enunciation. Now, compound enunciations are enunciations that are many simply, but one by conjunction, that is, one in a certain respect. There are a few kinds of compound enunciations. The first kind is one in which the conjunction is between the parts of the subject. For instance, Peter and Paul are in Rome. Here the conjunction is and. Another kind of compound enunciation is this one, where the conjunction is between the parts of the predicate. For instance, Peter is a fisher and an apostle. A third kind of compound enunciation is one in which the conjunction is between two complete enunciations. For instance, Peter preaches and Paul preaches. Here's another example, which is a little more subtle. If Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. Here we have a conjunction, namely the words if and then, joining together two enunciations, such that one is the consequent, namely our faith is in vain, and one is the antecedent, or condition, Christ did not rise from the dead. This sort of enunciation, which was given in this last example, is called a hypothetical enunciation or conditional enunciation. You should become very familiar with these terms and know when to recognize a conditional or hypothetical enunciation. These assert that some consequent, such as our faith is in vain, is true, not simply speaking, but on the condition that the antecedent is true, namely something like Christ did not rise from the dead. Remember that an enunciation is speech in which there is truth or falsehood. Compound enunciations, and in particular hypothetical enunciations, are not enunciations properly speaking, but only by analogy, precisely because they don't have truth, simply speaking. Instead, they assert some truth only on the condition of some antecedent, such as Christ did not rise from the dead. That's why the division of enunciations into one and many is analogical and not a division into species of enunciation. The third kind of enunciation, when we divide enunciations in this analogical way into one and many, is a kind of enunciation in which there are simply many enunciations and there's no conjunction. Here are some examples. Peter preaches. Paul preaches. In that example, there's obviously just two enunciations. There's no conjunction. Here's another example. Christ rose from the dead. Our faith is not in vain. Again, we just have two enunciations. It's not one enunciation. There's no conjunction. So, in summary, we have categorical enunciations, which are simply one enunciation. They're just simple enunciations. And then we have compound enunciations, which are multiple enunciations which are somehow united by a conjunction. And then a third kind of enunciation, which is many enunciations. That is, enunciations strung together without a conjunction. The one of most importance to us in this video and in this book are categorical enunciations. For the most part, we'll ignore compound enunciations and multiple enunciations until a later point. Logicians have for a long time described the division of categorical enunciation into its proper species as a division by quality. What's meant by quality here is the essential quality or the essential character of an enunciation. The essential character or quality of enunciation obviously gives us its species. There are two species of categorical enunciation. These are affirmation and negation. Affirmation is defined by Aquinas as enunciation signifying something about something. Negation is defined as an enunciation signifying something separated from something. Now, these two definitions can be a little difficult to interpret because they're so streamlined. They say nothing that's not essential to affirmation or negation. Let's look at first what's similar between the definitions, and then let's look at the difference. In both definitions, we see that the word something appears twice. The first occurrence of the word something is referring to the predicate of an enunciation. The second occurrence of the word something is referring to the subject of an enunciation. So an enunciation, whether affirmative or negative, signifies the predicate of an enunciation. An affirmation signifies that predicate as being about the subject, that is, as belonging to the subject. In contrast, a negative enunciation, or a negation, signifies that predicate as being separated from the subject. Viewed in this light, these two definitions seem remarkably accurate. This division of categorical enunciation is into the two species of enunciation for this reason. The verb is a formal part of enunciation. The formal part of anything is that which makes the thing what it is. Now, as we saw in the last video, verbs are defined as the sorts of things that imply predication. That is, they're always a sign of something said of something. Thus, an enunciation is impossible without there being a verb. Thus, verbs are what make enunciations what they are. Therefore, verbs are the formal part of an enunciation. Therefore, we take the species of an enunciation, that is, the essence or definition or species of an enunciation, from the kind of verb that's in the enunciation. Now, the verb in enunciation can be either affirmative or negative. For instance, is an affirmative verb, is not would be a negative verb. Is signifies that the predicate is joined to the subject, whereas is not indicates that the predicate is separated from the subject. Composite enunciations are only enunciations by analogy to categorical enunciations. Categorical enunciations are what we mean by enunciation when we say that word without any qualification. Here's an example. If it is raining, then the ground is wet. This is a composite or compound enunciation. More specifically, it's a hypothetical or conditional enunciation, like the one we saw earlier. Enunciation, as we saw in the last video, is defined as a sort of perfect speech in which there is truth or falsehood. Now, there is truth or falsehood in the enunciation, if it is raining, then the ground is wet, but it's not an absolute truth or falsehood. It's a conditional truth or falsehood. The enunciation, if it is raining, then the ground is wet, is asserting that the ground is wet, that is true, on the condition that it is raining. It's not asserting, simply speaking, that it's true that the ground is wet. In contrast, if we had a categorical enunciation along the lines of the ground is wet, this would be asserting some truth or falsehood, simply speaking. That is, without any condition. And that's why we say that categorical enunciations are enunciations simply speaking, whereas compound or composite enunciations are enunciations in a certain respect or by analogy. Now that we've divided enunciation by quality, let's divide categorical enunciation by quantity. Whereas quality looked at the verb or predicate of enunciations, quantity looks at the subject of an enunciation. In order to understand this division, we first need to understand what a universal is and what a singular is. A universal is what is of such a nature as to be predicated of many things. For instance, human is apt to be predicated of both Plato and Socrates, because both of them are human. Likewise, dog is apt to be predicated of both Clifford and Fido, since they're both dogs. So too, qualities like wise and just are apt to be predicated of multiple individuals. For instance, Socrates was wise, and Solomon was wise, and therefore wise is able to be predicated of multiple individuals, and therefore wise is a universal. Universals' names signify only what is common in a thing. For instance, when I predicate wise of Solomon, I'm only talking about that quality which he shares in common with Socrates. I'm not talking about what distinguishes Solomon from Socrates. In contrast to universals are singulars or individuals. What is a singular or an individual is what is not of such a nature as to be predicated of many things. There are two kinds of singulars or individuals. First is the concrete singular. This is the more common one. A concrete singular is something that signifies both what is common in a thing and what distinguishes that thing from others with the same nature. For instance, Socrates, this dog right in front of me, and Clark Kent are all concrete singulars. Socrates signifies both what's common in Socrates, namely his human nature, and what distinguishes Socrates from other humans like Plato, namely his individual matter. So Socrates shares something in common with the word human because human also signifies what's common in Socrates, but Socrates is distinct from the word human because it adds something to the word human, namely what distinguishes Socrates from other humans, namely Socrates' individual matter. This dog is also a concrete singular name because it designates a dog that I'm pointing to. Likewise, Clark Kent is a concrete singular name. This is an interesting example because we could predicate Clark Kent of something else apparently. After all, can't we say Clark Kent is Superman and Superman is Clark Kent? So is it the case that Clark Kent can't be predicated of anything else? Well, it's true that Clark Kent can be predicated of another name for Clark Kent, namely Superman. Nevertheless, Clark Kent is not the sort of thing that's apt to be predicated of many individuals. Clark Kent can be predicated of himself or of other names of himself, but he can't be predicated of other things besides himself. In contrast to concrete singulars are abstract singulars. These signify common characteristics such as human nature or qualities like wise, but they signify these common characteristics not as common, but instead as if they were singular. For instance, the word justice, humanity, wisdom, all of these words are abstract singulars. To see this, let's just consider the difference between the word wisdom and the word wise. Wise can be predicated of Solomon because Solomon has wisdom. Nevertheless, we cannot predicate wisdom of Solomon. We cannot say that Solomon is wisdom. So wisdom is not the sort of name that's apt to be predicated of multiple individuals. Likewise, humanity. Humanity differs from human because we could say Socrates is human, but we cannot say Socrates is humanity. Humanity is signifying the same thing as human, but it does so in such a way as to signify it as if it were a singular, not a common nature. And therefore humanity, unlike human, cannot be predicated of individuals, and therefore it's a singular. Aquinas distinguishes three ways in which we can predicate about singulars. The first way is to predicate what pertains to singulars only in the mind or in the soul. For instance, if we say Socrates is not predicable of multiple individuals, The predicable of multiple individuals, obviously doesn't belong to Socrates outside the mind. It only belongs to Socrates as a concept in our mind, which can be predicated or used in a sentence. The second way we can predicate about singulars is to predicate what pertains to a singular in virtue of its common nature. For instance, if we say Socrates is human, we predicate of Socrates something that belongs to Socrates, not as this individual distinct from Plato, but as a member of the human race. In this sense, what we predicate of Socrates would also be predicated of Plato and of Aristotle. Here's another example. Clifford can bark. The predicate, can bark, belongs to Clifford not as this individual dog, but as sharing something in common with all dogs. The third way in which we can predicate about singulars is to predicate what belongs to a singular by reason of itself as this singular. For instance, if we say Socrates is walking, the predicate walking doesn't belong to Socrates as a human, since not all humans are always walking, but instead it belongs to Socrates precisely as this individual in virtue of his own individual characteristics or accidents. Likewise, if we say Clifford is barking, this belongs to Clifford not as any dog, but as this dog which is currently barking, which happens to be barking. Not all dogs are barking, and so this doesn't belong to Clifford merely as a dog, but instead it belongs to him as this individual dog. Just as there are multiple ways to predicate about singulars, so too there are multiple ways to predicate about universals. The first way is to predicate of a universal as separate from singulars. This is subdivided into two ways. We can predicate what pertains to a universal only in the mind. For instance, when we say, man is a species. Obviously, individual men are not species. Therefore, the predicate species only belongs to the subject, man, insofar as that subject is not in things outside the mind, but instead is a concept within the mind. Likewise, if we say animal is a genus, the predicate only belongs to the subject insofar as that subject is considered as a concept in the mind. The second way to predicate of universals as separate from singulars is to predicate what pertains to the universal outside the mind. Here we might take as an example the sentence, man alone is nobler than all irrational creatures. Here, we're predicating about man not as a universal connected to singulars, but instead as if it were a thing in itself, man alone. Nevertheless, what we predicate of man alone is something which is actually true of human nature outside the mind, namely that it's nobler than all the other natures. The second way to predicate about universals is as in singulars. So the first way was to predicate of universals as separate from singulars. Now we're predicating of a universal as in singulars. This also is subdivided. The first way in which we predicate of a universal as in singulars is when we predicate of that universal in view of the universal nature itself. For instance, if we say man is animal, we're predicating something that belongs to individual men outside the mind in virtue of their common nature, in virtue of the nature which occupies the subject position in the sentence. Likewise, if we say bread is food, we're predicating something that belongs to the nature in the subject sentence of the sentence. Again, if we say trees can grow, we're predicating a property that belongs to individuals and to the nature in virtue of the nature, which is the subject of the sentence. In a different way, we can predicate of universals as in singulars in view not of the universal nature itself, but instead in view of the singular in which the universal is present. For instance, when we say man walks, we're predicating something of the nature, namely man, but we're predicating something that only belongs to the nature in virtue of the individual, namely the individual who happens at this moment to be walking. The same goes for the sentence, dog sits. We're predicating something of the nature in the subject position that doesn't belong to the nature in the subject position as that common nature, but instead in virtue of some individual which has that nature and happens to be sitting. Let's pay close attention to the second way of predicating about universals, namely the way of predicating about universals as in singulars. This is going to be extremely important for the rest of the course. Predicating of universals as in singulars is so important precisely because it explains the meaning of certain words we use on an everyday basis but probably don't understand. Words like every, all, some, no, and none. All of these words can be understood if we understand what it is to predicate about a universal as in singulars. To see this, let's first define the technical term from logic, namely quantifier. Quantifiers are particles added to a universal present in singulars to determine the mode in which the universal is to be taken in relation to those singulars. There are two kinds of quantifier. The first is the universal quantifier. This is a quantifier which determines that the universal should be taken according to the whole multitude of singulars under it. In other words, if we have a universal like man, this needs to be taken according to all of the individuals underneath that universal, namely Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and so on. All of those individual men need to be taken with the universal when it has a universal quantifier attached to it. The universal quantifiers are either affirmative, like every and all, or in Latin omnis, or negative, like no or none, in Latin nullus. So the affirmative universal quantifier is every or all, and the negative universal quantifier is no or none. Now, these quantifiers were invented or coined by humans precisely in light of sentences in which we predicate about a universal as in singulars in view of a universal nature itself, not in view of the singular. So take the examples we gave on the previous slide. Man is animal, bread is food, trees can grow. None of these sentences have quantifiers attached to their subject, and as a result, they're somewhat awkward or ambiguous. Do we mean some man is an animal, or do we mean every man is an animal? Well, notice that when we add a quantifier to the subject of the sentence, suddenly the sentences in these examples become much less awkward and much more natural. If instead of saying man is animal, we say every man is animal, that makes a lot more sense. Or if we, instead of saying bread is food, we say all bread is food, suddenly the sentence becomes much more natural. Likewise, when we say instead of trees can grow, all trees can grow, the sentence again becomes more natural. So quantifiers, namely universal quantifiers, were invented precisely in light of sentences in which we predicate about a universal as in singulars in view of the universal nature itself. The second kind of quantifier is a particular quantifier. This quantifier determines that the universal should be taken according to some part of the whole multitude of singulars under it. Although a particular quantifier is compatible with taking all of the individuals underneath the universal, it only requires that we take some of the individuals under the universal. For instance, man need only be distributed to Socrates, not to all individual men. The affirmative particular quantifier is either some, or a certain. In Latin, it's aliquis, or quidam. the negative particular quantifier is not all, or non omnis. In sentences, this will often show up as some words, and then not. Again, notice that the particular quantifier makes the examples we gave much more meaningful. If we take the example from the previous slide, man walks, this is somewhat awkward because it doesn't have a quantifier. But when we add a particular quantifier, some, suddenly the sentence makes more sense. We say, some man walks. We're not saying every man walks, not every individual man is walking right now, but instead we're saying some man walks. Socrates, for instance. We're not saying Plato and Aristotle are necessarily walking, just some man. Likewise, when we say dog sits, we're only necessarily talking about some part of the universal dog. We're not talking about every individual underneath that universal. This is why particular quantifiers are called particulars, because they only require that some part of the universal be included. So, in general, quantifiers were invented or coined precisely to make sense of sentences which are predicating about universals as in singulars. When they're predicated about a universal as in singulars in view of the universal nature itself, they're apt to have a universal quantifier attached to the subject term. Likewise, when they're predicating about universals as in singulars in view of the singular in which the universal is present, they're apt to have a particular quantifier attached to the subject term. The result of the preceding analysis of quantity is that there are 4 kinds of enunciation based on the quantity of the subject of an enunciation. The first is a universal enunciation. This is one where the subject is universal and it's taken universally. For instance, every dog barks, no dog flies. In both cases, we have a universal for the subject term, namely dog. And in both cases, we have a universal quantifier attached to that subject term, namely every and no. The second kind of enunciation is a particular enunciation. This is one where the subject is also universal, but it's taken particularly, not universally. So, like the previous kind of enunciation, the subject of these particular enunciations is universal. But unlike the universal enunciation, the subject does not have a universal quantifier attached to it, but instead a particular quantifier. Here are the examples. A dog is sitting. Some dog has rabies. Notice that the subject term is still universal, namely dog, but it has a particular quantifier attached to it, namely a or some. It does not have a universal quantifier attached to it, and that's why it's called a particular enunciation and not a universal enunciation, despite the fact that it has a universal for its subject term, just like universal enunciations. The third kind of enunciation is a singular. This is an enunciation where the subject is a singular, that is, a word not predicable of multiple individuals. For instance, Clifford is sitting. Socrates is pale. These enunciations aren't incapable of having quantifiers attached to their subject terms. Obviously, it would make no sense to say every Clifford is sitting. Clifford isn't the sort of thing to be distributed to multiple individuals. The final kind of enunciation is an indefinite enunciation. This is an enunciation which we use fairly rarely in English precisely because we have quantifiers. Indefinite enunciations are enunciations where the subject is a universal without any quantifier to determine how the universal should be taken. For instance, the sentence, man is rational, or the sentence, dog is mammal. In both of these cases, the sentence is fundamentally ambiguous. We don't know whether to interpret the sentence, man is rational, as every man is rational or as some man is rational. Both are compatible with the meaning of an indefinite sentence. Thus, indefinite sentences should for the most part be avoided. We should usually, if we have a universal for our subject term, quantify it with either a universal quantifier or a particular quantifier. In summary, universal enunciations, particular enunciations, and indefinite enunciations all have universal terms for their subject. They differ from one another by what they use to quantify that universal subject. Universal enunciations use a universal quantifier. Particular enunciations quantify the universal subject term with a particular quantifier. And indefinite enunciations don't quantify the subject at all. They leave it ambiguous. Singular enunciations are the only kind of enunciation that don't have any universal term for their subject term. Instead, they have a singular for their subject term, like Clifford or Socrates or humanity. In summary, as we said before, there are 6 ways to divide enunciations. So far, we've dealt with the first 3 of these ways. We've divided enunciations into one and many, into categorical and composite. We've also divided enunciations by quality into affirmative and negative enunciations. Finally, we've also divided enunciations by quantity into universal, particular, indefinite, and singular enunciations. What's next is for us to divide enunciations by comparing them to things outside the mind, such that we get true and false enunciations. We will do this only for categorical enunciations, and we'll do it in light of what we've said about the division of enunciation by quality and quantity. We'll leave this further analysis for a later video. In that video, we'll talk about the all-important concept, the square of opposition. Until next time.
Sed excedens vim naturae